Now that we have our create item or our to-do item create component working, and it is actually handling both the obtaining of data from the input fields through the input references to those input fields, as well as the change handlers that handle the on-change event of those input fields. And we have our submit handler that's attached to our submit button. And down here in our component did mount, we have our handlers assigned to the change events on those inputs and the click event on the submit handler. What this really means is that our create to-do item component is done, and the creation of a new component or a new to-do item is ready to go. And we have our handler right here. Unfortunately, our handler, all it really does is lets us know that something happened and prints out the state. Now, if you remember, let's go ahead and turn on our front end right here. Let's do an npm start. Let it compile, and then we should have it on localhost 3000 as soon as this is done rendering. Okay. Starting the development server. Looks like we're ready to go. So if I refresh this, we're good to go. So now we can see that we have the initial state right here of our component. And since this is a create new, let's go ahead and let's get rid of that initial state right here and right here. So now our initial state are empty strings, and that initial state is being loaded in as the default value in here. Now with inputs, we'd usually have, as an option in our inputs, we usually have a placeholder text that we can add. So let's add some placeholder text, and let's just do name of to do. And then let's add a placeholder right here for our description. And let's just say, what should we do? Let's make this one better. Let's say, what should we call it? Right. Once it compiles, we come back. Here we've got the placeholder text, which of course, placeholder text just kind of informs us as to what this input is about, which means we could actually get rid of the name and the description labels. We're going to leave them for now. And now we've got that empty string as the initial state for our new to-do, because this particular component is in charge of creating a single new to-do item. And then we have ourselves our inputs, and we're ready to go. Now, right now, if we click submit, we should see down here the empty name and description. And now if we add something in here, say, pick up kids from school. And maybe that's a better description. Let's move that down here to description. And let's just say kids school. Go ahead and click submit. We should see that inside of our description, and that's really good. But as of right now, this new to-do that's sitting here inside of our state, or is actually represented by our state object, is now solely inside of this component. It's stuck inside of this component. We do not see it added to our to-do list, and therefore our component really serves no purpose. It has a lot of cool functionality and is prepared to create a new to-do, but when we click submit, really it does nothing. So since it has gone about creating this new to-do, we need to get this to-do back up and put into the list. So if we look at our UI that we created, let me go ahead and pull up the UI we had. So we've got our React to-do mockup. Here we go. Go back to our sandbox. All right. In our mockup right here, our component right here, the to-do item create component, it's doing what it's supposed to, but it has not sent the to-do back up so that we can get it into this list. If we open up our screen ink so that we can write on the screen, let's go ahead and talk through how this might work. So first of all, we have our create item component right here. And it's in charge of creating a new component, a new to-do item. Then we have our to-do list component, which is in charge of rendering the list. And then we have our app.js, which is our orchestrating component. And it actually has the list. So if we look at our list of to-dos as a list of objects right here, we have inside of that list individual to-do items. And that list is controlled and modified, updated. It's under control of our app.js. So our app.js actually owns that list. So it is owned by our app.js. It is passed to our to-do item list, and then the to-do item list is responsible for passing each to-do item to a to-do item display. If we go ahead and identify the to-do item display now. So in order for our new to-do item, let's say that a new to-do item was created right here. It lives inside of it. For our new to-do item to show up here as a new to-do item in the list, we need to get this to-do item out of our create to-do item into this list, and then this list is then passed to our to-do item list, which then would allow our to-do item to end up inside of this list. And then when this list gets re-rendered or passed from the app.js down into our to-do item list, this item then will be rendered inside of our list. So that's what we're targeting for. The problem here is that because props is a unidirectional data object, meaning that it only goes one direction. So if we identify the direction that props goes, I'm going to use orange right here. This object right here, when the list gets passed down to the to-do list item, it's passed through the props, which means it only goes that one direction. And then as the to-do item list iterates over our list of to-dos and passes a single to-do item to a to-do item display, that to-do item is passed through props and it only goes that one direction. It never gets passed back up. In other words, a to-do item display never passes a to-do item back up to the to-do item list. And a to-do item list never passes the list back up to the app.js. It only goes one direction. It flows down from parent to child, and then from this parent to this child. Same thing goes on with our create to-do item, or our to-do item create component. When it is set up, it really doesn't have any state passed to it by the parent component. Instead, it's creating its state from scratch inside of itself. Now, because it didn't receive anything through props, and because we don't have any global way of letting our app.js know that a new to-do item was created and it needs to add it to the list, we run into a communication problem. So the way we solve this communication problem is that we add what I like to call a notification handler. So very similar to a event handler that we're used to, or a callback handlers they're called. Instead, what I like to do is I create what I call an event handler, or a notification handler. And this notification handler lives inside of whichever component needs to know about something happening inside of one of its children components. With this, we've got this app.js, and we have this notification handler. And so with that notification handler, it is important that the app.js knows when a new to-do item is created. That way it can pull that to-do item into its list. So what we do is we actually pass a notification handler, so a reference to this function right here. We pass it into our to-do item create component as a notification handler. And this reference gets passed in through the props into our to-do item create component. Now, when this save button is clicked, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it in red. When this save button is clicked, we know that we already have a to-do item because it's in the state of our to-do item create component. So now, what happens is that our save state event, or our save event for our to-do item create, it will take our to-do item from the state, and it will then call this function that was passed in as a reference. So you can kind of see this circle right here, this communication circle. So the notification handler is passed in through props. When the save event happens, this notification handler is called, and the new to-do item is passed as a parameter to this notification function. And now this new to-do item is inside, oops, let's use a box. This new to-do item, I want that to be green. There we go. This new to-do item sits right here because it was passed from within the to-do item create component, passed into our notification handler, and then from our notification handler, that to-do item is then passed into the list by our app.js. So this is kind of the communication that we can do between parent and children components if we're not using something like Redux or a pub/sub library, which are some more complicated libraries and patterns that we can use to make this communication simpler. But to start out with, it's good for you to learn how we can do child to parent or parent to child communication when we have a props object that is unidirectional, meaning that it only flows down to the child. By passing down notification handlers, we can pass them down unidirectional, in other words, one direction down into the child component, but because it is a function that we can call as a handler, we can then notify the parent that something happened within a child component, and we can potentially pass data into that notification handler and have this parent component then handle that data passed in and then have it placed into, in this instance, into our list. So this is the functionality we are going to implement right now. So let's go ahead and let's hide our screen ink, and let's come back here to our code. All right. Now, if we remember, we go to our app.js, we have our to-do list, which takes in all of our to-do items. Our to-do item list right now as dummy data is stored inside of our app.js because we're not connected to an API yet. So this is the list that is owned by our app.js component, so this functional component. It passes that to-do items list into our to-do list component, and then we have our to-do item create component. As you can see right now, no data is being passed to this component through props or through properties. And we need to change that by adding to our app.js a new notification handler that lets it know that we have information that has come, or some event has happened. In this case, it's the create to-do item event has taken place, and that we have a new to-do item that needs to be added to our to-do item list. Now, in the initial design of our application, we chose to make our app component a functional component, but the reality is that it actually has data that it is in charge of. So before we go on to implementing the parent-child communication chain, we're going to go ahead and change this into an actual class-based or stateful component, because in reality, it does have state. It has this to-do items list, and we want our component to manage that rather than, right now, it's plain old JavaScript inside of our app.js module. Let's go ahead and put it inside of a class-based or stateful component. So to do that, we say class, and we're going to call it app, and it extends React.component. Now we have our component here. This function that we have right here, really, we can just cut, and if we come in here, we can actually put that inside of the render, because it's really just our render function. So let's go ahead and put it there. let's delete the function keyword and app and just call it render. And now we have a full-blown render. And you can see how functional components are really just the render function of a stateful component. So you can kind of see how that works. It's kind of interesting that a functional component is really just the render function of a class-based component, and pretty nifty. All right, so with our class-based or stateful component, we of course need a constructor. And of course it takes in props. And then we need to do our super and call props. And now, inside of our constructor, we're going to set up our initial state, this dot state. And inside of our state, we are going to move our to-do items dummy data list, because we want to make sure that our app, oops, I went too far. Make sure that our app is the one controlling this list. So we'll go ahead and cut that out. We're going to put it inside of our state. And as part of our state, get rid of that semicolon. We're going to go ahead and tab this in so that it's sitting nicely nested inside of our state. Get rid of our comment right there. And then of course, because we're adding a property, get rid of the let, change this to a colon. All right, now inside of our state, we have a to-do items list. And now our component is actually managing this list as part of the state. And with that set up, now we can come down here and we have to change this to use this.state.to-do items. So we save that. We can see it compiles now. We had errors before. If you looked at that, we should have compiling errors because to-do items is not defined because it's no longer a global JavaScript variable. It's now a part of state. And that's where we went ahead and changed it to this.state.to-do items. That means we are now getting to this list of to-do items that is inside of our state. And if we come back to our component or back to our UI, we should see that everything still works. Change this, submit, we see a name and a description. Still is not being added to the list. And now we're going to implement that functionality now that we have a stateful component that's managing our to-do items. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to add a notification handler. Now, in effect, these are identical to event handlers or callback handlers or whatever you're used to calling them or reading about them. Really, I just call them notification handlers. They're really just event handlers. They're really just callback handlers because we're really just allowing the child component to call back to the parent component and inform it that a new to-do item was created. But I like to call them notification handlers because we're notifying the parent of an event or something that happened inside of the child component. For that, I'm going to go ahead and put a note right here saying that these are our notification handlers. And we're going to do a new handler, and this is going to be to-do item created. So let's do a to-do item created handler. And it is going to bring back some data, which is our to-do item. And then it is inside of this handler that we're actually going to handle this to-do item and adding it to our state. And we're going to see how to do that in a second. So let's go ahead and put a to-do here. Add new to-do to this.state.to-do items array. Right, that's our to-do node. Now, as with any new method that we add to a class-based or stateful component, if we want it to be a part of the component, we need to, inside of our constructor, we need to bind it. So let's do this.to-do item create handler equals this.to-do item create handler dot bind, pass it this, and now this method becomes an official method of our React component. With that, we can now pass this to-do item created handler to a to-do item notification. And so we add it as a property of the props object, or a property of our component, which means it'll come in on that props object, just like we did with our to-dos inside of our to-do list. So let's go ahead and add a new one. So this is going to be to-do item created event. And I'm just giving it whatever name I want. You can give it whatever name you want. And then we are going to pass this dot to-do item create handler. So that way we know that when this event happens, this handler is going to be called inside of our to-do item create. So I'm going to go ahead and add a console.log just so we can see this happening. And I'm going to say notification handled, and then we are talking about to-do item created. All right, so now we have a way to see that this is actually happening. Now let's go back to our to-do item created component, and inside of our props we now have that handler passed to us, which we called, go back to my app.js, it's the to-do item create handler, and we called it to-do item created event. So we're going to call that event, which means we're going to execute that handler. So down here inside of our submit handler, we're going to go ahead and we're going to call that event. So we're going to call this dot props dot to do item created event, and then we are going to pass it this dot state, because our state really represents that object. If we go back to our state up here and we look at it, it's the name and description, which is pretty much what we have up here, is a name and a description and an ID. Now the ID we're going to add when a new one gets created. We're just going to go ahead and add an ID to it based on the next one in the list, or the next number in the list. So let's do that really quick. Actually, let's go ahead and execute this. Now that we've got our actual handler being called, so this event being called, and our handlers being executed, and the state of our component is being passed, and we see that everything is compiling down here. Let's jump over to our browser. Let's see how this works. Let's say kids : school, and then pick the kids up from school at 3:30 p.m. today. And if we click submit, we will see the custom event, the submit button handler, was called, and then we printed out the state. And now down here we see a notification handled, and the to-do item created notification handler was called. Now let's go ahead and let's verify that the actual object is being passed to our create handler, and let's just go ahead and add to this the to-do item that we're getting back as a parameter. So we're going to go ahead and print it out as part of the console.log. So let's come back. Let's say school, kids school, and then pick up kids. We're not going to go long on that. Submit. All right, so the custom event, that's our submit button, it got handled, and we see kids school, and then my poorly spelled pick up kids. Then we have notification handled. Inside of our app.js, we've got a to-do item was created, and here's our to-do item. You can see that the to-do item from the state of our create, or to-do item create component, is now passed up to our app component. And now we have that new to-do item. So if we come back here, we can see that this notification is actually coming all the way to the app, so it is propagating from our to-do item up to our app through this notification handler. Now that we have this, really, we just need to add it to our to-do item list inside of our state. And then when our component refreshes upon the state change, that list will be passed down to our to-do list, and our to-do list will render it with the new to-do item in it. So we just need to add the new to-do item to it. So we can do this dot set state, and then inside of our set state, we are going to want to merge in or add this to-do to our current to-do items. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. Let's make sure we're using the same syntax. To-do items. So we're going to set to do items equal to this dot state dot to do items. We're going to do dot push, and then we're going to pass in that to do into that list, and then that list is going to be assigned to this, and then when the set state happens, we're going to have new to do item added to it. Let's see if that works. We're guessing that it's going to work, but let's see if it actually works. And this is where constantly testing your code as you write it is super important as you're programming, because you're making a lot of assumptions based on what you've done in the past, and you have to verify that it actually works before you move on to something else. And that's why we are constantly flipping from our application to it actually running, or the running instance of our application, in order to make sure things are working. So let's do kids, school, and then pick up kids. Let's go ahead and click submit. We got an error here. Let's see what happens. Props.todos.map is not a function. And that's inside of our list. Props.todos.map. And that tells me that at some point our to-do items is coming back as undefined. Because if this to-dos doesn't have a map function, that means it is not an array. So something is wrong here. So we've got to look at this. And what we can do to see what's going on is go ahead and refresh our page. Let's go to our sources. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Let's go to our components under source, components. And then we want to go to our app.js. And then right down here, where we're doing this set state change, we're going to pause right there. And we're going to go ahead and look at this. This.state.todoitems.push. To do items, and inside of our state, we called it to do items, and it is an array. So you would think we should be able to do a push on it and push this item into that array. But it might have something to do with this dot set state. So let's go ahead and see what happens again. Let's just put some garbage in there. Click submit. All right. Now if we look at this dot state dot to do items right here, it has 5 items in it. It is an array of objects. And if we look at our to do, it is an object with a description and a name. And yet we're failing right here. So let's see, let's go ahead and click play on this. Still getting that error within our to-do items list because the props.todos is no longer valid. So let's go into our to-do list, go into our list, and then right here we've got our list, and it says our todos.map is where the problem is. So let's put a breakpoint there, refresh our page so we're in a clean state, put in some garbage, click submit. Here's our to-dos, so props.todos, and let's go over here into our scope. Let's look at props, to-dos. It's the number 6. It's not an array. It's the number 6. So that's where we're running into problems here. So let's go back to our code. Here, let's click play again so we're out of that. Go back to our code. Let's think about what we are actually doing right here when we do this dot state dot to do items and we push a to do on there. When we push a to do onto an array, it doesn't actually give us back a new array. What it gives us back is the new number of items inside of our array. So we don't want to do this right here. Let's go ahead and do this right here. And then let's set our this.setState to our actual to-do items list right here. And let's see if that handles the issue. Let's see if that fixes our problem. Click play. I'm going to refresh this really quick. Click play. All right. So we should have a break right here before it goes into state. And then we still have our break on our to-do list to see if this list is a list or if it's back to just an integer. So let's go ahead and put some garbage in, click submit. Here we've got this.state.todos, and you can see our to-dos array now has 6 items in it, and the 5th one is name and description. We can see right now we have a bug because we have no ID for this 5th one. So we're probably going to get an error when we list this, when we try to use the item.id for the key in our list. But at least now we know that we have a list. If we click play, let's look at our console. Yep, just as I thought we would have a key issue right here because our to-do item doesn't have an ID. So we need to give it an ID, a unique ID. So let's go ahead and handle that as well inside of our to-do item create handler. And usually what we'd want to do is kind of verify what all of the IDs are, because we might be adding and removing items constantly and we don't want to have a duplicate ID in there. But since our list is dummy data and it's pretty set right now, we're not going to get into the complexities of making sure we have unique IDs or unique keys. So we're not going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to go ahead and hack it. And we're just going to say to-do.id equals 6, because we know it's the next unique key we want to use is 6. Now again, remember, this isn't a proper solution. There's a more complex solution that we would need to use in order to make sure that all of our IDs are unique, especially when we get into adding and removing to-dos or completing to-dos. And if we delete to-dos, we will want to make sure that we're not reusing IDs. So right now, I'm just going to go ahead and set it to 6 because we know that's the next one, just for speed, just so we can get through this demonstration. So let's come back. Let's reload our page. Oops, it was still compiling. All right, let's reload the page. Well, let's come back here, make sure that our actual application is ready to go, rerun. And it looks like our browser is frozen. So let's close that, open up a new one, put that in there. There we go. And then let's open up our oops, that's a new tab. Open up this. Here we go. Console. Refresh the page. Okay, our breakpoints are still working. Okay, let's do a new one. Let's do kids, school, and then let's do pick up kids from school at 3 p.m. Click submit. We'll see our new to-do item. We will see that to-do item now has the ID 6 because that's what we set in the statement before. And now when we click play, now we see that our to-do list is an array with 6 items in it. Of course, arrays are 0 indexed. And if we expand this, we should see a description, ID, and name. So if we click play again, we now see the new item added to our to-do list. And we should not see any errors regarding keys because we have a unique ID. And now we have just successfully added a notification handler that allows a parent to pass down a notification handler to a child and allows that child to call the handler in order to let the parent know that something has happened that it needs to know about. And then the parent can then decide what it is going to do with that event. And in this case, of course, it is the creation of a new to-do item. When the to-do item create handles the submit, it calls that event handler, passes it the state, which represents a new to-do, that is passed up to our to-do item create handler. That to-do item is brought in. We assign it a unique ID. Of course, this is a hacky way of doing it. Then we add that new to-do to our to-do items. And then we go ahead and set the state with that modified to-do items list as the new to-do item list, and everything works great. So if we refresh the page, we can go ahead and add as many new to-dos to our application as we want. And that is how we use notification handlers in order to propagate information from a child component up to a parent component.